When Private First Class Daniel Reeves demonstrated his useless trick to a circle of laughing soldiers behind the ruins of a French farmhouse on the 7th day after D-Day, showing them how he could reload his M1 Garand in complete darkness using nothing but sound and touch in under 3 seconds, nobody imagined that this seemingly pointless skill, developed during countless sleepless nights in basic training when insomnia drove him to disassemble and reassemble his rifle by feel alone, would become the tactical innovation that would turn the tide of one of the bloodiest engagements in the Normandy campaign, save an entire company from annihilation, and transform how American infantry units would approach night combat for the remainder of the war. But on that gray morning when Daniel crouched behind a sandbagged position with smoke rising from destroyed buildings behind him, his rifle raised and his hands steady despite the chaos surrounding him, he had no way of knowing that the ridicule he'd endured for his obsessive nighttime practice was about to be vindicated in the most dramatic and deadly way possible. Daniel Reeves was 22 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the permanent furrow in his brow made him look closer to 30. He'd grown up in rural Montana, the youngest of 4 brothers, 3 of whom were already serving in various theaters of the war. His father had been a hunting guide and had taught all his sons to shoot before they could read, instilling in them a respect for firearms that bordered on reverence. Daniel had enlisted the day after his 18th birthday, driven by a mixture of patriotic duty and the simple fact that all the Reeves men served when their country called. What set Daniel apart from most soldiers wasn't his marksmanship, though he was an excellent shot, but rather his relationship with his weapon. While other soldiers treated their M1 Garands as tools, necessary equipment to be maintained and used, Daniel saw his rifle as an extension of himself. He'd been assigned his particular M1, serial number 1624537, during basic training at Camp Roberts in California, and from that first day he'd become obsessed with knowing every millimeter of the weapon, every spring and pin, every quirk and characteristic that made his specific rifle unique among the millions produced. The obsession had started innocently enough. Daniel suffered from severe insomnia, a condition that had plagued him since childhood but that had worsened dramatically under the stress of military training. While other recruits collapsed into exhausted sleep after brutal days of physical training and weapons drills, Daniel would lie awake on his bunk, his mind racing with thoughts of home, worries about his brothers, and anxiety about the combat he knew was coming. To occupy his restless mind and hands, Daniel had begun a nightly ritual. In the darkness of the barracks, while his fellow soldiers snored around him, he would quietly disassemble his M1 Garand by touch alone, lay out all the pieces in a precise pattern on his bunk, and then reassemble the weapon entirely by feel, never using his eyes even when dawn began to break and light filtered through the windows. At first, the process took him nearly an hour, his fingers fumbling with unfamiliar components, occasionally dropping a pin or spring that would clatter softly in the darkness. But Daniel was nothing if not persistent. Night after night, he repeated the ritual, and night after night, his fingers grew more confident, more knowing. He began to understand his rifle not through sight but through touch and sound, the distinctive click of the operating rod sliding into place, the subtle resistance point when seating the trigger group, the satisfying snick of the bolt locking home. He learned to identify which spring made which sound when compressed, which pins seated with a whisper and which with a click. His fellow soldiers noticed, of course. Private Eddie Martinez, who bunked next to Daniel, was the first to comment on the strange nightly ritual. "Reeves, what the hell are you doing over there in the dark? You're like a damn raccoon going through garbage." "Just practicing," Daniel had replied quietly, not wanting to wake the others. "Practicing what? We drill with these things all day. Don't you ever sleep?" "Can't sleep. Might as well do something useful." Word spread through the barracks about Daniel's odd habit, and opinions were divided. Some thought it was admirable dedication. Others, particularly Sergeant Miller, their drill instructor, thought it was eccentric behavior that bordered on obsessive. Private Reeves, Sergeant Miller had said one morning after observing Daniel reassembling his rifle after a cleaning inspection with his eyes closed, "You planning to fight this war in the dark?" "No, Sergeant," Daniel had responded, standing at attention. "Then why the hell are you playing with your weapon like it's some kind of puzzle toy?" "I want to know it completely, Sergeant." inside and out. What if I need to clear a jam in the dark? What if my weapon malfunctions at night and I can't see to fix it? I want to be ready for anything. Miller had studied Daniel for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That's either the smartest or the dumbest thing I've heard all week, and I'm not sure which. But I'll tell you this. If that obsessive behavior of yours interferes with your performance or distracts your unit, you and I are going to have a serious problem. Understood? Yes, Sergeant. Daniel had continued his nightly practice despite the mild mockery and raised eyebrows from his fellow soldiers. By the time his unit shipped out to England in preparation for the invasion of Europe, he could disassemble and reassemble his M1 Garand in complete darkness in under 10 seconds. He knew the weight and feel of every component. He could diagnose malfunctions by sound alone. He had developed such an intimate understanding of his weapon that he could tell when something was even fractionally out of alignment just by the way it felt in his hands. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, Daniel's unit, Company B, 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, was part of the second wave hitting Omaha Beach. The horrors of that day would stay with Daniel for the rest of his life. The ramp dropping to reveal the beach swept with machine gun fire, the men falling around him, the water turning red, the sound of bullets striking flesh and metal, the screams of wounded men drowning in the surf. Daniel had made it across the beach through a combination of luck, determination, and the training that had become muscle memory. His rifle had performed flawlessly that day, and he'd found grim comfort in the familiar weight and balance of the weapon in his hands as chaos erupted around him. In the days following the invasion, as Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, the fighting settled into a brutal pattern of small unit engagements through the hedgerows of Normandy. The Bocage country, with its ancient hedgerows forming natural fortifications every few hundred yards, turned every field into a potential battlefield and every advance into a costly struggle. It was during this period, 7 days after D-Day, that Daniel first demonstrated his trick to his fellow soldiers. The company had taken position around a ruined farmhouse, and during a brief lull in fighting, the men were cleaning weapons, eating cold rations, and trying to steal a few moments of rest. Someone had been complaining about how difficult it was to reload in the dark, how the stress of combat made even simple tasks become fumbling disasters when you couldn't see what you were doing. "I can reload in the dark," Daniel had said quietly, not boasting but simply stating a fact. Eddie Martinez had laughed. "Sure you can, Reeves. And I can tap dance on a mine field." "No, seriously. I've been practicing. I can do it by feel." This had attracted the attention of several other soldiers, and soon a small crowd had gathered. Lieutenant Kowalski, their platoon commander, had also wandered over to see what the commotion was about. "All right, Reeves," Martinez had said with a grin, "put your money where your mouth is. Johnson, give him your helmet." Private Johnson had removed his helmet, and Martinez placed it over Daniel's face, blocking his vision completely. Someone handed Daniel his M1, already loaded with an 8-round and block clip. "Now," Martinez continued, clearly enjoying himself, "eject that clip and reload. Let's see this amazing trick." What happened next would become legendary in Company B. With the helmet completely blocking his vision, Daniel's hands moved with practiced precision. He pressed the clip latch, caught the ejected clip before it hit the ground with his left hand while simultaneously reaching for a fresh clip from his cartridge belt with his right. The distinctive ping of the M1's clip ejecting was followed almost immediately by the solid click of a new clip seating, then the sharp metallic snap of the bolt slamming home. Total time, under 3 seconds. The watching soldiers erupted in a mixture of surprise, laughter, and impressed whistles. Martinez pulled the helmet off Daniel's head, shaking his own in disbelief. "I'll be damned," Martinez said. "That was actually pretty impressive. Completely useless, but impressive." "Why useless?" Daniel had asked, genuinely confused. "Because, Reeves," Martinez explained with exaggerated patience, "when do we ever fight in complete darkness? We've got flares, tracers, explosions. There's always some light. Nobody fights in pitch black." "I disagree with Private Martinez," Lieutenant Kowalski interjected, his voice thoughtful. "Impressive demonstration, Reeves. How long did it take you to learn that? About 6 months, sir. Started in basic training. Couldn't sleep, so I practiced. Can you teach it? Daniel considered the question. Maybe, sir. But it takes a lot of practice. You have to really know your weapon, understand it by feel. Kowalski had nodded slowly. Interesting. Keep up the practice, Private. You never know when a skill like that might come in handy. The other soldiers had drifted back to their duties, and the incident was largely forgotten as the company continued its advance through the hedgerows. But Kowalski, a thoughtful officer who had been a high school teacher before the war, filed the information away in his mind. He'd learned that war often turned conventional wisdom on its head, and that skills which seemed useless in training sometimes became invaluable in actual combat. 3 weeks after D-Day, Company B was assigned to capture a small village called Saint-Michel-de-Montaigne, a strategically important crossroads that German forces were defending with typical determination. Intelligence suggested the village was held by approximately 2 companies of Wehrmacht infantry supported by at least 2 machine gun nests and possibly a tank or self-propelled gun. The attack was scheduled for dawn, with Company B advancing from the west while another company would attack from the south, hopefully catching the Germans in a pincer. It was a straightforward plan, the kind that looked simple on maps but that everyone knew would be complicated and bloody in execution. Daniel spent the night before the attack doing what he always did, silently disassembling and reassembling his rifle in the darkness while the other men slept. His fingers moved through the familiar routine, finding comfort in the repetitive motions, in the certainty of knowing exactly where each piece belonged and how each component fit together. Around him, men snored, muttered in their sleep, or lay awake with their own pre-battle thoughts. Eddie Martinez, who still slept in the foxhole next to Daniel's, whispered across the darkness. "Hey, Reeves. You awake?" "Yeah." "You scared about tomorrow?" Daniel paused in his work, holding the bolt assembly of his rifle in one hand. It was a question no soldier wanted to answer honestly, because honesty meant admitting vulnerability. But Martinez was a good man, and they'd been through hell together. "Terrified," Daniel admitted quietly. "Every time. But you don't show it. You're always so calm, so focused on that damn rifle of yours." "The rifle's the only thing I can control," Daniel explained, continuing to work the bolt, feeling the smooth action, checking for any hint of roughness or resistance. "Can't control the bullets coming at me. Can't control the orders or the plans. But I can control this. I can make sure my weapon is perfect, that it'll work when I need it to. That's something. You're a strange guy, Reeves. But I'm glad you're in my squad." Dawn came gray and cold, with fog rolling across the fields. The company moved out at 0530, advancing in dispersed formation through the pre-dawn gloom. Daniel moved automatically, his rifle at the ready, his senses alert for any sign of enemy activity. The village of Saint-Michel-de-Montaigne materialized gradually out of the fog, its church steeple emerging first like a ghostly finger pointing at the sky, then the outlines of buildings becoming visible. They were within 200 yards of the village when the Germans opened fire. The morning erupted with the characteristic tearing sound of MG-42 machine guns and the crack of rifle fire. Men dropped, some dead before they hit the ground, others wounded and crying out. The company hit the dirt, seeking what cover they could find in the open field. Lieutenant Kowalski was on the radio immediately, trying to coordinate with the other company that was supposed to be attacking from the south, but the response was not what he wanted to hear. The southern attack had been delayed by German resistance. Company B was on its own, pinned down in an open field by heavy fire from a well-defended position. The situation rapidly deteriorated. The Germans had clear fields of fire, and any attempt to advance resulted in immediate casualties. The company was taking fire from at least 3 different positions, including one particularly effective machine gun nest that was sweeping the field methodically, searching for targets. Several men were hit trying to crawl backward to better cover. The company was in danger of being wiped out if they stayed where they were, but advancing seemed suicidal. Kowalski made a decision. "We're pulling back to the tree line," he called out, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Covering fire, then fall back by squads. 3rd squad, you're first." It was a reasonable tactical decision, but implementing it proved nearly impossible. The moment men rose to fall back, German fire intensified. 2 men from 3rd Squad were hit immediately. The withdrawal quickly threatened to turn into a rout, with panicked soldiers abandoning their positions and running for the tree line. Daniel saw what was happening and knew they needed to do something to break the German fire superiority, even temporarily. He spotted a slight depression in the ground about 15 yards ahead, not much cover, but better than their current position. Without waiting for orders, he sprinted forward, diving into the shallow depression as bullets kicked up dirt around him. From this position, slightly elevated compared to the rest of the company, he could see the muzzle flashes of the German positions more clearly. "Please, get back here!" Kowalski shouted, but Daniel was already firing, methodically placing shots toward the machine gun position that was causing the most casualties. His shooting was disciplined, controlled. 2 shots, shift aim slightly, 2 more shots. The distinctive ping of his M1s and block clip ejecting was drowned out by the surrounding gunfire, but his fingers automatically executed the reload he'd practiced thousands of times, seeding a fresh clip without his eyes ever leaving the German positions. His fire had the desired effect. The German machine gun position temporarily shifted its attention to him, giving the pinned-down soldiers behind him precious seconds to reach better cover. But it also meant Daniel was now drawing concentrated fire from multiple German positions. Dirt and stone fragments exploded around him as bullets impacted all around his shallow hole. "Reeves is pinned down," Martinez shouted to Kowalski. "We've got to help him. If we move, they'll cut us down," Kowalski responded grimly, but his mind was working, trying to find a tactical solution to an impossible situation. The firefight continued through the morning, with Company B gradually managing to pull back to marginally better positions but still unable to either advance or completely withdraw. Daniel remained in his forward position, essentially acting as a one-man suppression point that occasionally forced the Germans to keep their heads down, but he was isolated and running low on ammunition. Every clip he expended brought him closer to the point where he'd be defenseless. By noon, the situation had become a stalemate that favored the Germans. Company B had taken 30% casualties, was low on ammunition, and had made no progress toward its objective. The Southern Company's attack had been completely halted. Battalion headquarters was demanding progress but offering no additional support. Kowalski knew that if they stayed in their current positions until dark, the Germans might launch a counterattack that could annihilate what remained of the company. As the day wore on and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Kowalski called together his squad leaders for a hurried conference behind what remained of a stone wall. Daniel had managed to crawl back to friendly lines during a brief lull in the fighting, rejoining his squad exhausted and down to his last 3 clips of ammunition. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Kowalski began without preamble. "We can't stay here, we can't advance in daylight, and we can't withdraw without exposing ourselves to devastating fire. Battalion says the Southern Company won't be in position to renew their attack until tomorrow morning at the earliest. So here's what I'm thinking. We wait until full darkness, then we try a night infiltration. Small teams moving quietly, trying to get close enough to the German positions to take them out with grenades and close quarters fighting." Sergeant Williams, a veteran who'd fought in North Africa, shook his head skeptically. "Sir, with respect, night attacks are a nightmare. Half the men will get lost, we'll end up shooting each other, and the Germans will hear us coming and light us up. I've seen it go bad too many times. I'm aware of the risks, Sergeant, but I don't see any other options. We've got about 6 hours until full darkness. I want squad leaders to start preparing their men. Select your best soldiers for the infiltration teams. We'll move out at 2,200 hours." As the meeting broke up and the squad leaders returned to their positions, Daniel approached Lieutenant Kowalski. "Sir, can I speak with you privately?" Kowalski looked at the young private with tired eyes. "Make it quick, Reeves. I've got about 1,000 things to do before nightfall." "Sir, it's about the night attack. I think I might have an idea that could help." "I'm listening." "The biggest problem with night fighting is that nobody can see what they're doing. Men fumble with their weapons, can't reload quickly, can't clear jams. It creates chaos and confusion. But what if we trained a small team, just a few men, to do everything by feel? To be able to reload, clear malfunctions, everything in complete darkness. Kowalski studied Daniel's face, remembering the demonstration weeks ago. You're talking about that trick of yours. The reload in the dark. Yes, sir. But not just reloading. Everything. I can teach men to maintain their weapons by touch, to operate them without sight. If we had even a small team that could fight effectively in complete darkness, they could infiltrate the German positions while the enemy is blind and we're not. Private, we have 6 hours until the attack. You really think you can teach men in 6 hours what took you 6 months to learn? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head honestly. No, sir. I can't make them experts. But I can teach them the basics, enough to reload by feel, enough to clear a simple jam, enough to check that their weapon is ready to fire without fumbling around. It's not perfect, but it's better than sending men into darkness when they can't even reload their own rifles without seeing them. Kowalski was silent for a long moment, weighing the idea. It was unconventional, based on one soldier's unusual skill set, and there was no guarantee it would work. But then again, the conventional approach, a standard night attack, had a very high probability of turning into a disaster. At least this might give them some small advantage. All right, Reeves. You've got 4 hours. I'll assign you 6 men, the ones I was already planning to put on the infiltration teams. If you can teach them anything useful in that time, great. If not, we go ahead with the attack anyway and hope for the best. Pick a quiet spot behind the lines and get to work. Thank you, sir. I'll do my best. Daniel selected a partially collapsed barn about 200 yards behind their frontline positions. It was far enough from the fighting that they wouldn't be interrupted but close enough to get back quickly if the Germans launched an attack. The 6 men Kowalski assigned to him were a mixed group, some experienced veterans, some relative newcomers like himself. Eddie Martinez was there, along with Private Johnson, Corporal Hayes, Private First Class Cooper, Private Anderson, and surprisingly, Sergeant Williams, the skeptical veteran from the earlier meeting. All right, listen up, Daniel began, feeling awkward in an instructional role he'd never sought. Lieutenant Kowalski thinks I can teach you something that might help tonight. I'm not going to waste time with speeches or explanations. We're going to jump straight into practical work. He held up his M1 Garand. This is your weapon. You've been training with it, fighting with it. You think you know it. But do you really? Close your eyes. All of you. Now tell me, without looking, without touching it, exactly where the clip latch is positioned. Which direction does the safety rotate? How many pounds of pressure does your trigger require? The men looked at each other uncertainly. Williams spoke up. With respect, Private, we don't have time for guessing games. We have a real fight coming in a few hours. Exactly, Sergeant. And in that fight, you won't be able to see your weapon. You'll be fumbling in the dark, trying to reload by feel, getting frustrated and panicked when things don't work right. That fumbling could get you killed. Now, are you going to give me 4 hours to possibly save your life? Or would you rather go into that attack tonight knowing you can't even reload in the dark? William stared at Daniel for a long moment, then slowly nodded. All right, Private. You've got my attention. What do you want us to do? For the next 4 hours, Daniel put the men through an intensive crash course in blind weapons manipulation. He started with the simplest task, having them eject and reload clips with their eyes closed. What should have been a simple 3-second operation took most of them over a minute at first, with dropped clips, fumbled ammunition, and frustrated curses. Stop, Daniel said after watching Johnson struggle for the 3rd time. You're trying to do it the way you do it in daylight. Looking for the clip, looking for the rifle, using your eyes to guide your hands. That's not going to work in the dark. You need to let your hands do the thinking. Feel the weight of the clip. Feel where the rifle naturally wants to receive it. Trust your sense of touch more than your sense of sight. Gradually, painfully, the men began to improve. Daniel moved between them, offering corrections, demonstrating techniques. He showed them how to keep their thumb on the clip latch while their other hand reached for a fresh clip, how to use the rifle's balance to tell if it was properly loaded, how to feel with their fingertip to check if a round was properly chambered. The M1 tells you everything you need to know if you learn to listen to it, Daniel explained. The sound of the clip seating, the feel of the bolt, the weight distribution, All of it is information. In complete darkness, you can't see the enemy, but you can still know exactly what condition your weapon is in. Martinez proved to be a quick learner, his hands adapting rapidly to the new techniques. This is actually pretty amazing, Reeves. I can't believe you've been doing this all along and we've been making fun of you. It's fine. It seemed useless at the time. As the sun set and darkness began to fall over the battlefield, Daniel moved on to more complex skills, clearing jams by feel, checking safety conditions, even field stripping and reassembling components. None of the men became experts in those 4 hours, but they all improved dramatically from where they'd started. More importantly, they gained confidence that they could operate their weapons in conditions of limited or no visibility. Sergeant Williams was the last to admit the value of the training. As the session was wrapping up and the men were practicing their new skills one final time, he approached Daniel quietly. "Private Reeves, I owe you an apology. When Lieutenant Kowalski told me about this training idea, I thought it was a waste of time. I've been in this army for 8 years, fought in 3 campaigns, and I figured I knew everything about my weapon. But you've shown me that I was operating blind, literally, in a crucial area. If we make it through tonight, I'm going to recommend that this kind of training becomes standard for all infantry." "Thank you, Sergeant. That means a lot." "Don't thank me yet. We still have to survive the attack." At 2,145 hours, as full darkness settled over the battlefield, Lieutenant Kowalski gathered the infiltration teams for final instructions. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. 3 teams of 4 men each would advance silently through the darkness toward the German positions. Their objective was to get close enough to throw grenades into the machine gun nests and create chaos in the German lines. Once the grenades went off, the rest of Company B would launch a general assault, hopefully catching the Germans disorganized and unable to mount effective resistance. Daniel was assigned to the team led by Sergeant Williams, along with Martinez and Cooper. Each man carried extra grenades, with their rifle ammunition deliberately reduced to save weight, the thinking being that if they had to use their rifles, the mission had already failed. "Remember," Williams whispered to his team as they prepared to move out, "absolute silence until we throw the grenades. No talking, no unnecessary movement, watch where you step. The Germans will have listening posts out there, so we need to be ghosts. If you get separated, freeze in place until you reorient yourself. Better to move slow and steady than fast and noisy." Questions? There were no questions. The men checked their equipment one final time, ensuring nothing would rattle or clank. Daniel went through his pre-combat ritual, running his hands over his M11 last time, verifying by feel that everything was in perfect order. The familiar routine calmed his racing heart somewhat, giving him something to focus on besides the fear. At precisely 2,200 hours, the 3 infiltration teams slipped into the darkness, moving slowly and carefully across the field they'd been pinned down in earlier that day. The night was overcast with no moon, making visibility nearly zero. Daniel could barely see his hand in front of his face, and his teammates were just darker shadows against the black landscape. They'd covered perhaps 50 yards when Williams suddenly froze, his hand raised in the halt signal that Daniel could barely make out. They waited, motionless, as German voices drifted across the darkness. A patrol or listening post, impossible to tell which. The voices came closer, close enough that Daniel could hear the crunch of boots on soil, could smell cigarette smoke. His hand tightened on his rifle, ready to bring it up if they were discovered. The German patrol passed within 15 feet of their position, the soldiers talking quietly in their language, completely unaware of the American soldiers frozen in the darkness mere yards away. It took every ounce of Daniel's self-control not to hold his breath, knowing that even that small sound might give them away. After what felt like hours but was probably only 5 minutes, the German patrol moved on, their voices fading back toward the village. Williams waited another full minute before signaling the team to continue their advance. They crept forward, moving in short bursts of 10 or 15 feet, then freezing to listen and observe. The village was taking shape ahead of them, darker silhouettes against the dark sky, with occasional glimmers of light from covered windows or shielded lanterns. Daniel could hear German voices more frequently now, along with the sounds of a military position at night. Equipment being moved, orders being given, the routine sounds of soldiers going about their duties. Williams led them to a position about 30 yards from what they'd identified during daylight as one of the main machine gun emplacements. Through hand signals, he indicated their next move. They would crawl forward to within grenade range, throw their explosives simultaneously, then fall back to where the rest of the company would be advancing under cover of the explosions. They began the final approach, crawling on their bellies across the cold ground. Daniel's heart was hammering so hard he was certain the Germans must be able to hear it. Every small sound seemed magnified: the rustle of his uniform, the clink of his rifle against a stone, his breathing that seemed as loud as a freight train. They just reached what Williams judged to be optimal grenade range when everything went wrong. Somewhere to their left, one of the other infiltration teams must have been discovered, because the night suddenly erupted with gunfire and shouting. Flares shot into the sky, casting harsh white light across the battlefield. In the sudden illumination, Daniel could see German soldiers scrambling to defensive positions, officers shouting orders, weapons being brought to bear. "Throw now!" Williams screamed, abandoning stealth as their position was suddenly exposed in the flare light. All 4 men pulled pins and hurled their grenades toward the German positions. The explosives arced through the flare-lit darkness and detonated with satisfying crumps, sending up fountains of dirt and debris. But the surprise was gone. The Germans were alert and responding. Return fire began immediately, bullets cracking past Daniel's head as he scrambled for any available cover. The other 2 infiltration teams were also discovered and pinned down, their positions marked by muzzle flashes in the darkness. "Fall back," Williams ordered. But even as he gave the command, he grunted and went down, hit in the leg. Martinez grabbed the sergeant and began dragging him backward while Cooper and Daniel provided covering fire, shooting toward the German muzzle flashes. And then Daniel's worst fear materialized. In the chaos and darkness, as he tried to reload after expending his current clip, his fingers, so practiced and confident during training, fumbled the operation. The fresh clip didn't seat properly, and when he tried to force it, the entire assembly jammed. In daylight, it would have been a simple fix. In darkness, under fire, with adrenaline flooding his system and panic setting in, even his trained hands couldn't immediately diagnose the problem. "Please, give us covering fire," Martinez shouted, still dragging the wounded Williams toward safety. Daniel's mind raced. His rifle was jammed. In the darkness and chaos, trying to fix it conventionally was taking too long. German soldiers were advancing toward their position, and his teammates needed him. He forced himself to take a breath, to block out the noise and fear and chaos, and to trust the training he'd done thousands of times. His hands moved automatically, executing the diagnostic routine he'd practiced so many times in the darkness of the barracks. Feel the clip, not seated properly. Feel the bolt, partially forward, putting pressure on the clip. Solution: release the bolt, remove the bad clip, clear any obstructions, reload with a fresh clip. His fingers moved through the sequence with practiced precision, and within 5 seconds his rifle was operational again. He was back in the fight, firing controlled bursts toward the German positions. But they were still in serious trouble. The infiltration had failed, the company's main assault was being stopped by heavy German fire, and casualties were mounting on both sides. It was then that Daniel noticed something crucial. The Germans were having the same problems his squad had struggled with during training. In the chaos and darkness, German soldiers were fumbling with their weapons, taking longer to reload, hesitating because they couldn't see what they were doing. The flares had died out, plunging the battlefield back into darkness, and while that made accurate shooting nearly impossible for both sides, it gave a slight advantage to anyone who could operate their weapon confidently in the dark. And thanks to Daniel's training, 12 American soldiers could do exactly that. "Martinez! Cooper!" Daniel called out. "Use your training. Reload by feel. Don't wait for light." The 2 men understood immediately. While German soldiers around them were fumbling in the darkness or waiting for the next flare to see what they were doing, the Americans reloaded smoothly, their hands finding clips and seating them with practiced confidence. It wasn't much of an advantage, But in a fight this close and chaotic, even a few seconds could make the difference between life and death. Daniel called out to other members of his company who had received the training, reminding them to trust their hands rather than their eyes. Slowly, incredibly, the tide of the firefight began to shift. American soldiers who could maintain sustained fire in the darkness were forcing German soldiers to keep their heads down, to hesitate, to waste precious seconds fumbling with equipment they couldn't see properly. Lieutenant Kowalski, positioned with the main body of the company, saw what was happening and made a quick tactical decision. All personnel with night weapons training, advance. Everyone else, provide supporting fire. The 12 soldiers who had trained with Daniel pushed forward, moving with a confidence that surprised even themselves. They weren't charging blindly, they were advancing tactically, using cover, working in teams, but doing it all in darkness that would have paralyzed them just hours before. Daniel found himself in the lead, his M1 an extension of his body, his hands performing operations he didn't need to consciously think about. Eject clip, catch it. Pull fresh clip from belt. Seat it with a solid click. Bolt forward. Fire. The routine was so ingrained that he could focus on tactics and positioning rather than worrying about his weapon. A German soldier rose up from a position just yards away, his Kar 98K rifle coming up to fire, but he was struggling in the darkness to work the bolt action. Daniel's M1, with its semi-automatic capability and his practiced reload, allowed him to fire first. The German fell, and Daniel immediately moved to cover, knowing that revealing his position with muzzle flash made him a target. The firefight was brutal and confused, with both sides sometimes firing at sounds or shadows rather than actual visible targets. But gradually, the Americans' slight advantage in darkness operations began to tell. German positions that had seemed impregnable during daylight were overwhelmed in the darkness by soldiers who could reload and maintain fire without needing to see their weapons. Sergeant Williams, despite his wounded leg, had managed to crawl into a position where he could direct the final assault. Push them. They're breaking. Keep advancing. The German defense began to collapse. Soldiers who had fought with discipline and determination during the day found themselves outmatched at night by an enemy that seemed able to operate in darkness as if it were daylight. Some began to withdraw, then more, and finally the entire German force was pulling back from the village, abandoning their positions. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to color the eastern horizon, Company B had secured Saint-Michel-de-Montagne. The cost had been high, 23 dead and 37 wounded out of a company strength of 120, but they had achieved their objective when conventional tactics had failed. As the sun rose, illuminating the battlefield and the destroyed village, Lieutenant Kowalski walked among his men, checking on casualties, organizing defensive positions in case of counterattack, and trying to process what had happened during the night. He found Daniel sitting against a wall, his rifle across his lap, methodically cleaning it despite his obvious exhaustion. The young private's hands moved through the familiar motions automatically, even as his eyes struggled to stay open. "Reeves," Kowalski said, sitting down beside him. "What you did today, the training, the idea, the execution, that was extraordinary." Daniel looked up, surprised. "Sir, we lost a lot of good men. I don't feel like we did anything extraordinary. We lost men because we were fighting a war, Private. But without your training, without that advantage in darkness, we would have lost a lot more. We might have lost everyone. I've already radioed battalion about what happened. They want to implement your training methods across the entire division." "Sir, I'm just a private who couldn't sleep and practiced with his rifle. I'm not qualified to train entire battalions." "Maybe not," Kowalski acknowledged. "But you saw something that nobody else saw, a vulnerability in how we train soldiers. You identified a gap in our capabilities, and you found a solution. That's what makes the difference between someone who just follows orders and someone who changes how wars are fought." Over the following weeks, as word spread about Company B's night action at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne, Daniel found himself pulled from regular combat duties and assigned to a training detachment. His job was to work with instructors to develop a standardized program for teaching soldiers to operate their weapons in conditions of limited visibility. The program they developed, which would eventually be adopted not just across the division but throughout the U.S. Army's infantry units, was based on the simple principle that had driven Daniel's original obsession. Soldiers needed to know their weapons not just with their eyes but with their hands, their sense of touch, their muscle memory. The training wasn't easy, and not every soldier mastered it to the level Daniel had achieved. But even partial proficiency made a significant difference. Soldiers who went through the night weapons training showed improved performance not just in darkness but in all combat situations. The confidence that came from truly knowing their weapon, from trusting that they could operate it under any conditions, translated into better performance across the board. Sergeant Williams, recovered from his leg wound and back on duty, took particular interest in expanding the training. He worked with Daniel to develop advanced modules that went beyond basic reload drills to include malfunction clearing, tactical movement in darkness, and coordination between team members when visual communication was impossible. You know what the real genius of this was? Williams told Daniel one day as they were developing training materials. It wasn't just teaching men to reload in the dark. It was forcing them to really understand their weapons at a fundamental level. When you know your M1 well enough to operate it blindfolded, you know it well enough to use it effectively under any condition, whether that's combat stress, adverse weather, fatigue, whatever. The darkness training is just the tool we use to develop that deeper understanding. Daniel had never thought about it that way, but he realized Williams was right. His original obsession with nighttime rifle manipulation had been about control, controlling the one thing he could control in a chaotic world. But in teaching others, he discovered that the real value wasn't in the specific skill but in the mindset it developed. The idea that your weapon should be so familiar, so much an extension of yourself, that you could use it without conscious thought. As the war in Europe progressed and American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the night weapons training became standard across infantry units. Other armies took note, with both British and Canadian forces adopting similar training methods. After-action reports consistently showed that units with the training performed better in low-light conditions, had fewer weapon malfunctions under stress, and showed greater overall combat effectiveness. Daniel continued to serve through the end of the war in Europe, participating in several more actions but never returning to regular line duty. His role as a trainer and technical advisor kept him primarily at rear echelon positions, where he worked with new replacement units to ensure they had the training before being sent forward to combat. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Daniel was processing the experience of surviving the war when he received orders to report to Paris for a special ceremony. He had no idea what to expect, but when he arrived at the headquarters building and was ushered into a conference room, he was stunned to find himself facing several high-ranking officers, including a general he recognized from news photographs. Private First Class Daniel Reeves, the general began, your innovative approach to infantry training has been recognized as a significant contribution to the Allied victory. Your methods have been credited with saving hundreds, possibly thousands of American lives by giving our soldiers a crucial advantage in night combat situations. On behalf of a grateful nation, I am authorized to present you with the Bronze Star for meritorious service. Daniel stood at attention as the medal was pinned to his uniform, overwhelmed by the recognition. But what he would remember most from that ceremony wasn't the medal or the general's words. It was what happened afterward, when the officers left and he was approached by a captain from the training command. Private Reeves, I wanted to thank you personally, the captain said, shaking Daniel's hand. My younger brother was in one of the units that received your night weapons training before his first combat action. His company got into a night firefight 2 months ago, very similar situation to your action at St. Michel. My brother told me that the training saved his life. He was able to clear a jam in complete darkness when German soldiers were advancing on his position. Without that training, without the confidence you gave him in his ability to operate his weapon in any condition, he would have died. So thank you. You saved my brother's life even though you've never met him. It was in that moment that Daniel truly understood the reach of what he'd created. His inability to sleep, his obsessive nighttime practice with his rifle, his useless trick that had made his fellow soldiers laugh, all of it had led to a training method that was spreading throughout the army, touching thousands of soldiers he would never meet, potentially saving lives on battlefields he would never see. When Daniel finally returned home to Montana in late 1945, he brought with him not just his Bronze Star and his M1 Garand, which the Army had allowed him to keep as a souvenir, but also a deep understanding of how small observations, pursued with persistence, could have outsized impacts. He returned to civilian life, using his GI Bill benefits to study mechanical engineering at Montana State University. His experience with weapons systems led him to a career in manufacturing, where he applied the same principles of intimate knowledge and continuous improvement that had guided his rifle training. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet life that seemed unremarkable to his neighbors. But in military training facilities across America and around the world, Daniel's legacy continued. The night weapons training he'd pioneered evolved and expanded, eventually incorporating night vision technology and other advances, but always maintaining the core principle: soldiers must know their weapons so well that they can operate them under any condition, with or without the aid of technology. In 1964, nearly 20 years after the end of World War II, Daniel received an invitation to speak at the Army Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Now a middle-aged civilian with thinning hair and reading glasses, he was initially reluctant to return to his military past. But the invitation intrigued him, and he made the trip. At Fort Benning, he was given a tour of the modern infantry training facilities and was amazed to discover that night weapons training, now far more sophisticated than his original version, was still a core component of infantry preparation. Young soldiers were learning the same basic principles he'd taught, practicing the same fundamental skills of operating weapons by feel and sound rather than sight. During his presentation to a group of instructors and officer candidates, Daniel was asked about the origins of his training method. "It started with insomnia," he explained, getting a laugh from the audience. "I couldn't sleep, so I practiced with my rifle." But the real lesson wasn't about the rifle. It was about the value of obsessive attention to detail, of understanding your tools so deeply that they become extensions of yourself, and of being willing to pursue an idea even when everyone around you thinks it's useless or strange. A young lieutenant raised his hand. "Sir, do you still practice the techniques you developed?" Daniel smiled. "Every morning. I don't have an M1 Garand anymore, well, except for the one in my closet, but I apply the same principles to everything I do. I can disassemble my car engine blindfolded. I can operate all my woodworking tools in the dark. Once you develop that kind of intimate knowledge of your tools, once you learn to trust your sense of touch and sound as much as your sight, it becomes a way of approaching everything in life." That evening, the post commander hosted a dinner in Daniel's honor, attended by several dozen instructors and senior officers. During the meal, an older colonel approached Daniel and asked for a private word. "Mr. Reeves, I wanted to tell you something," the colonel said. "I was a young lieutenant in Germany in 1945. My unit received your night weapons training just before we participated in the final push across the Rhine. We got into a night action near Remagen, and I can tell you without exaggeration that the training you developed saved my life and the lives of many of my men. I've spent the last 20 years in the Army, and I've made it my mission to ensure that every soldier I'm responsible for receives proper training in operating weapons under all conditions. Your innovation changed not just tactics but the entire approach to how we think about weapons training." Daniel was moved by the testimony, but he also felt a need to clarify something. "Colonel, I appreciate the recognition, but I need you to understand, I wasn't trying to change the Army or revolutionize training. I was just a kid who couldn't sleep and found something to do with his hands in the dark. The fact that it turned out to be useful was almost an accident." The colonel smiled. "Mr. Reeves, the best innovations are often accidents. But turning an accident into a systematic training method that saves lives, that takes something more. That takes the ability to recognize value where others see only eccentricity. That takes the courage to advocate for an idea even when you're just a private and everyone else is telling you it's useless. Those qualities are rarer and more valuable than you seem to realize." Daniel returned to Montana after his visit to Fort Benning with a renewed appreciation for the unexpected paths life could take. He'd gone to war as a frightened young man with insomnia and an obsessive need to control something in an uncontrollable world. He'd come home a veteran with a story that few people knew but that had influenced thousands of lives. In his later years, Daniel would occasionally speak at veterans' events or schools, always emphasizing the same themes: the value of persistence, the importance of paying attention to details others overlooked, and the idea that you never knew which skills or obsessions might turn out to have unexpected value. He kept his M1 Garand in a place of honor in his study, and sometimes, when insomnia still occasionally plagued him, he would take it down and go through the old routine, disassembling and reassembling it in the darkness, his fingers remembering movements practiced tens of thousands of times over the decades. The rifle had been with him through the worst days of his life and through the moment that defined his military service. It was more than just a weapon. It was a reminder that sometimes the strangest obsessions, the most ridiculed habits, the skills that everyone else called useless, could turn out to be the things that made the difference between life and death. When Daniel Reeves passed away in 1998 at the age of 76, his obituary in the local Montana newspaper mentioned his Bronze Star and his service in World War II but said nothing about the night weapons training method he'd pioneered. He'd never sought publicity or recognition beyond that single ceremony in Paris in 1945. But at his funeral, attended by family, friends, and neighbors who had known him as a quiet engineer and devoted family man, 3 unexpected visitors appeared in full military dress uniform. They were officers from the Army Infantry School, and they had traveled from Fort Benning specifically to honor Daniel's passing. During the service, they presented his family with a framed commendation acknowledging Daniel's contributions to infantry training and noting that his methods were still being taught to soldiers deploying to combat zones around the world. Daniel's eldest son, Michael, who had never fully understood his father's occasional late-night sessions in the study with the old M1 Garand, finally grasped the significance of what his father had accomplished. After the funeral, as he held the old rifle that had been such a fixture of his childhood, the weapon his father would sometimes let him hold while explaining the importance of really knowing your tools, Michael understood that his father's legacy wasn't just in the military training methods that bore his name in Army manuals. It was in the principle that obsessive attention to detail, persistence in the face of ridicule, and the willingness to pursue ideas others dismissed as useless could literally change the world. The Army officers who attended the funeral took possession of Daniel's M1 Garand, serial number 1624537, with the family's permission. It was transported to the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, where it was placed in a special exhibit about infantry innovations during World War II. The display included Daniel's original training notes, photographs from the night action at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne, testimonials from soldiers whose lives had been saved by the training, and the rifle itself, positioned as if ready to be field-stripped and reassembled by hands that knew every millimeter of its construction. The placard accompanying the exhibit read, "This M1 Garand rifle, serial number 1624537, was carried by Private First Class Daniel Reeves during the Normandy campaign of 1944. Reeves, an insomniac who spent his sleepless nights practicing blind disassembly and reassembly of his weapon, developed training methods that gave American infantry a crucial advantage in night combat. What began as one soldier's useless trick evolved into a training program that saved countless lives and influenced infantry tactics for generations. This rifle represents the power of unconventional thinking, persistent practice, and the recognition that sometimes the most valuable innovations come from the most unexpected sources. Years after Daniel's death, his story continued to resonate in military circles. In 2004, during the Iraq War, when American forces were again facing intense urban combat in conditions where night fighting was crucial, military historians revisited the innovations of World War II. Daniel's night weapons training methods were re-examined and updated for modern combat, with new technologies like night vision and laser sights being integrated with the fundamental principles he'd established, that soldiers must know their weapons so intimately that they can operate them under any condition, with or without technological aids. A young Marine lieutenant named Sarah Chen, preparing her platoon for deployment to Fallujah, came across Daniel's story while researching night combat tactics. Inspired by his approach, she implemented her own version of the training, having her Marines practice weapons manipulation in complete darkness, not just with their rifles but with all their equipment, radios, medical supplies, grenades, everything they might need to access in the chaos of night combat. During a particularly intense night engagement in Fallujah, Chen's platoon found themselves in a situation eerily similar to Company B's experience at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne 60 years earlier. Pinned down in darkness, taking fire from multiple positions, they were able to maintain effective return fire and maneuver successfully because every Marine in the unit could operate their weapons confidently in complete darkness. After the engagement, Chen wrote a letter to Daniel's family, telling them how their father's innovation, developed so many decades ago in response to simple insomnia, had saved lives in a war he'd never imagined, in a century he'd barely lived to see. The letter found its way to Michael Reeves, now in his 60s himself and retired from his own career as a high school teacher. Reading about how his father's work continued to save lives more than half a century after the original innovation moved him deeply. He began researching his father's military service more thoroughly, interviewing surviving veterans who had known Daniel, reviewing military archives, and piecing together the full story of the night action at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne. What Michael discovered was that his father's influence had been even more far-reaching than anyone had realized. The night weapons training had been just the beginning. The principles Daniel had established, of truly knowing your tools, of practicing fundamental skills to the point of muscle memory, of finding advantages in areas others overlooked, had influenced military training philosophy far beyond just weapons manipulation. Military psychologists in the 1950s and 1960s had studied Daniel's methods and recognized them as early examples of what would later be called stress inoculation training, preparing soldiers to perform complex tasks under extreme stress by overlearning fundamental skills until they became automatic. The idea that you could train soldiers to operate effectively in conditions of sensory deprivation or overload, that you could build confidence through repetitive practice in increasingly difficult conditions, had roots in Daniel's simple insomnia-driven practice sessions. Michael compiled his research into a book titled The Insomniac's Rifle: How One Soldier's Obsession Changed Infantry Training. Published in 2007, it brought Daniel's story to a wider audience beyond military circles. The book detailed not just the night weapons training and the action at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne, but also explored the broader implications of Daniel's approach to learning and mastery. Military educators began using the book in professional development courses, not as a technical manual but as a case study in innovative thinking. Daniel's story became a teaching tool for illustrating several important principles: that innovation can come from anyone regardless of rank or position, that persistent attention to detail can reveal solutions others miss, that skills which seem useless in one context can prove invaluable in another, and that the willingness to appear eccentric or obsessive in pursuit of mastery can lead to breakthrough achievements. At the Army Infantry School, Daniel's story was incorporated into the curriculum for officer candidates, used to illustrate the importance of listening to soldiers at all levels and remaining open to unconventional ideas. A case study based on Lieutenant Kowalski's decision to support Daniel's training proposal despite skepticism from higher-ranking officers became a standard teaching tool for classes on leadership and decision-making under uncertainty. But perhaps the most unexpected legacy of Daniel's work emerged in the civilian sector. As Michael's book gained readership beyond military audiences, experts in fields ranging from emergency medicine to firefighting to aviation began recognizing parallels between Daniel's methods and their own training challenges. The principle that professionals must be able to perform critical tasks under conditions of limited visibility, high stress, and sensory overload wasn't unique to military combat. It applied to any high-stakes profession where failure could mean death. Emergency room physicians began implementing lights-out training sessions where they practiced critical procedures in darkness or with severely limited lighting, preparing for situations where power failures or disaster conditions might compromise normal working environments. Firefighters who already trained for low-visibility conditions refined their methods based on Daniel's emphasis on building intimate tactile knowledge of equipment. Pilots incorporated similar principles into their training, enhancing their ability to operate aircraft controls by feel in situations where instrument failure or disorientation might compromise visual references. A trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Dr. Robert Kim, published a paper in 2010 titled tactile proficiency in emergency medicine, lessons from military training innovation, that directly cited Daniel's work and outlined a training program for surgical residents that emphasized developing the ability to perform critical procedures by touch alone. The program was adopted by several major medical schools and was credited with improving surgical performance in challenging conditions. In 2014, 70 years after the night action at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne, the Army Infantry School organized a commemoration event. Veterans from multiple eras, military historians, training experts, and members of Daniel's family were invited to participate in a symposium titled Unexpected Innovations: How Unconventional Thinking Changes Military Practice. Michael Reeves was invited to give the keynote address, and he stood before an audience of several hundred people, soldiers, officers, academics, and civilians, to talk about his father's legacy. "My father," Michael began, "was not a natural innovator. He didn't set out to change how the Army trained its soldiers. He didn't have grand ambitions to influence military tactics or save lives. He was just a young man who couldn't sleep, who found himself serving in a war he'd never imagined fighting, and who developed a coping mechanism for his insomnia by practicing with his rifle in the darkness." Michael paused, looking out at the audience. "But what made my father special, what made his useless trick into something that saved lives and influenced training methods for generations, was his willingness to persist with something that others ridiculed. His fellow soldiers made fun of him for his nighttime practice. His drill sergeant questioned his sanity. Even his friends thought he was wasting his time with an eccentric obsession. And yet," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger, "my father kept practicing. He kept refining his technique. He kept believing that understanding his weapon at that deep, tactile level mattered, even when he couldn't articulate why it mattered or how it might prove useful. That persistence, that willingness to appear foolish in pursuit of mastery, is the real lesson of his story." Michael went on to describe the night action at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne, the training session that preceded it, and the cascading effects that followed. But he ended with a more personal reflection. "In his later years, my father rarely talked about the war or his Bronze Star or the training methods he developed. When I asked him about it, he would say that he'd just been lucky to stumble onto something useful. But I think he was being too modest. Luck is finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk. What my father did required something more. It required the dedication to practice a skill thousands of times with no guarantee it would ever be useful, the courage to advocate for an unconventional idea to skeptical superiors, and the wisdom to recognize that intimate knowledge of your tools can make the difference between life and death. My father's legacy," Michael concluded, "isn't just in the training methods that bear his name or the soldiers whose lives were saved because they could reload in darkness. It's in the principle that we should never dismiss as useless the obsessions and peculiar talents that make each person unique. We should never assume that we've already figured out the best way to do something just because it's the way we've always done it. And we should always be willing to listen when someone, especially someone of lower rank or status, suggests an idea that seems unconventional or strange, because sometimes those strange ideas turn out to be exactly what we need." The symposium lasted 2 days, with presentations from military historians, training experts, and veterans who had experienced the impact of Daniel's methods firsthand. One of the most moving testimonies came from an 89-year-old veteran named Eddie Martinez, Daniel's friend from Company B who had been one of the first soldiers to receive the night weapons training. Martinez, now confined to a wheelchair but still sharp of mind, spoke about the night at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne and its aftermath. "I made fun of Danny Reeves for his weird trick with the rifle," Martinez admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "We all did. We thought he was crazy, spending hours in the dark playing with his weapon. But that crazy guy saved my life and the lives of dozens of others. And you want to know the real miracle? Danny never held it against us for mocking him. He never said, 'I told you so,' after the battle. He just quietly went about teaching others what he'd learned, never looking for glory or recognition." Martinez paused, wiping his eyes. That's the kind of soldier Danny Reeves was. That's the kind of man he was. And that's why, 70 years later, we're still talking about him and still using methods he developed. Not because he was trying to be a hero or make a name for himself, but because he cared enough to get really, really good at something even when everyone else thought it was pointless. The symposium concluded with the announcement of a new initiative, the Daniel Reeves Award for Innovation in Military Training, to be presented annually to a soldier, regardless of rank, who demonstrates innovative thinking in improving training methods or combat effectiveness. The first award was presented posthumously to a young specialist who had developed a new method for teaching tactical combat casualty care to soldiers with limited medical training, allowing infantry units to provide better immediate care to wounded soldiers before medics could reach them. As Michael Reeves left Fort Benning after the symposium, carrying with him the memories and testimonies he'd heard about his father, he reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a young man's insomnia in a barracks in California in 1943. That inability to sleep, which Daniel had probably seen as a curse for much of his life, had led him to discover something profound about the nature of mastery and the value of obsessive practice. Michael thought about all the times he'd seen his father in the study late at night, working with that old M1 Garand, and how he'd never fully understood what drove that ritual. Now he understood that his father had been maintaining not just a weapon but a connection to a moment in his life when his peculiar obsession had meant the difference between life and death, when his useless trick had proved to be anything but useless. The story of Private First Class Daniel Reeves and his M1 Garand, serial number 1624537, became one of those legends that military units tell to new soldiers, one of those stories that gets retold in different versions across different contexts, always with the same core message, that innovation can come from anywhere, that persistence in developing mastery is never wasted, and that we should never dismiss as useless the unique skills and obsessions that make each person different. Today, nearly 80 years after that night action at Saint-Michel-de-Montagne, soldiers in training facilities around the world still practice variants of the night weapons training that Daniel pioneered. The specific techniques have evolved with new weapons and new technologies, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Truly knowing your tools, understanding them not just intellectually but tactily and intuitively, can provide crucial advantages in situations where normal methods fail. And somewhere in the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, under carefully controlled lighting conditions to preserve its historic integrity, an old M1 Garand rifle sits in its display case, silent testimony to the power of obsessive practice, unconventional thinking, and the simple truth that sometimes the most important innovations begin with someone who can't sleep, has an idea that everyone else thinks is useless, and has the persistence to pursue that idea even when the whole world is laughing.